We all get curious about stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like things we hear about all the time. We want to really understand, but who's got time to go through all the long and boring stuff? That's what we do here for Joya. We're going deep into a fascinating Bible story from Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31. It's often called the story of the rich man and Lazarus. It sounds pretty simple at first glance, but oh boy, does it spark a ton of debate and different interpretations.
Absolutely. We've got a really interesting collection of sources here that we'll be drawing from. We'll be exploring how scholars have interpreted this passage, and of course, we'll be looking directly at the text itself. We're using the New American Bible Revised Edition, or the NABRE. Our goal today is to get to the heart of the story's message and unpack all those juicy scholarly discussions surrounding this really compelling narrative.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Picture this. A super rich dude living it up in absolute luxury, decked out in fancy purple clothes, finest linen, throwing extravagant feasts every single day. And right outside his massive house, at his gate lies a poor sick beggar named Lazarus covered head to toe in sores. All he's hoping for are a few scraps that fall from the rich guy's table. Sadly, the story takes a dramatic turn after they both die. Angels carry Lazarus to Abraham's bosom, a place of total comfort and honor. The rich man dies too, gets a fancy burial, but finds himself in Hades. Talk about a bad time. In Hades, he spots Lazarus way off in the distance, hanging out with Abraham. He begs for just a little relief, even a single drop of water to soothe his burning tongue. Abraham gives him a pretty firm reply. He reminds the rich man of all the good times he had while he was alive while Lazarus suffered. And to make matters worse, he tells him about this huge, uncrossable great chasm that now separates them. The rich man gets desperate. He asks for Lazarus to go back and warn his 5 brothers about the same fate. But Abraham says, nope. They have the scriptures, Moses and the prophets. If they won't listen to them, nothing will convince them.
The interesting thing is right off the bat with the story, a huge question pops up. Are we supposed to read this as a parable, like a teaching story, or as a historical account of what actually happens after we die? Most scholars lean pretty heavily towards the parable interpretation.
Okay, so why do most scholars see this as a parable and not a literal description of the afterlife?
There are a few key reasons. Firstly, look at where the story sits in Luke's gospel. It's smack dab in the middle of a section where Jesus is mainly using parables to teach. Second, the language is often figurative. Phrases like Abraham's bosom and the great chasm, they scream symbolism. They're like big, flashing neon signs pointing to spiritual truths, not literal descriptions. The whole point of this story seems to be teaching moral and spiritual lessons about wealth, poverty, and what happens after we kick the bucket.
So it's like a memorable way to drive the message home.
You got it. Some scholars even think Jesus might have been riffing on popular folk tales that were floating around at the time, stories with those familiar themes of reversed fortunes in the afterlife and warnings from beyond the grave. You know, by using those storytelling structures that his audience would have known, Jesus can make his teachings more impactful, more relevant to their cultural understanding.
But our sources also mention a few folks who argue for a more historical take. What's their reasoning?
Their main point usually revolves around Lazarus being specifically named. In most of Jesus' parables, the characters are nameless, more like general figures, right? So the fact that this beggar has a name makes some people think maybe it's a real person, or at least a well-known story. Plus, there's that detailed description of the afterlife, the torment by fire, the ability to see and talk across this huge gap. Some people interpret that level of detail as reflecting what people actually believed back then about the state of the dead, not just symbolic stuff. And lastly, some argue that the story lays out spiritual truths about judgment and the afterlife in a pretty straightforward manner, without those clear earthly metaphors we usually find in parables.
So it's the specific details that make it seem more real to some folks.
Exactly. The name and the detailed afterlife stuff lead some people to believe it's more than just a simple metaphor. But even those who see it mainly as symbolic recognize that the vivid afterlife imagery does give us a valuable peek into how people in Jesus' time thought about death and what came after. So, literal or not, it definitely hit home with their existing beliefs.
So even if it's not meant to be literal, it still tells us something about what people believed. Now, whether it's a parable or not, it's got some serious theological weight to it. Let's unpack that. The intermediate state, this Hades and Abraham's bosom thing, that seems like a biggie, right?
Absolutely. That's a major point in most interpretations. To first-century Jews and early Christians, Hades was basically the realm of the dead. But it wasn't like one big waiting room. It was often thought of as having different sections, one for the righteous and one for, well, let's just say the not-so-righteous.
In Abraham's bosom, that sounds like a pretty sweet deal. What was it all about?
It was seen as a place of comfort, honor, and total bliss. Imagine being chummy with Abraham, a massive figure in their tradition. And don't forget the great chasm that's crucial too. It's a symbol of no turning back. Once you're on one side or the other, there's no switching teams. It emphasizes the irreversible nature of the afterlife. Once you're there, that's it. It's not just some physical barrier. It's a metaphor for the fact that our choices have consequences, a point of no return, which should really make you think about the weight of your decisions.
It's interesting how different Christian groups have viewed the afterlife over the centuries. Our sources mentioned a bunch of those varying viewpoints.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There are definitely different takes on the details and length of this intermediate state. For instance, the Catholic Church has traditionally linked Abraham's bosom to the limbo of the fathers. It's a concept in Catholic theology where righteous folks who died before Christ came along hung out temporarily. Other denominations have different interpretations. Some see Hades as temporary, while others believe there's a final judgment after a period of what some call soul sleep. So yeah, you see a whole spectrum of beliefs about the afterlife in Christian thought.
Okay, so different groups have different interpretations. Another big idea that jumps out is divine justice and the total flip-flop of fortunes. It's not just about being rich or poor in this life, right? There's a deeper message about justice being served.
Exactly. It's not a simple wealth equals good, poverty equals bad equation. Most scholars agree that the rich man's suffering isn't just because he was loaded. It's about his massive lack of compassion, his utter disregard for Lazarus, who was struggling right outside his door. On the other hand, Lazarus, chilling with Abraham in the afterlife, is seen as a kind of payback for all the suffering he endured and his faith in God. It's a big warning against being selfish and indifferent, suggesting that how we treat others in this life has eternal consequences. It really throws a wrench in the whole wealth equals God's favor idea. The rich guy's major screw-up wasn't necessarily doing something bad but not doing anything good. He had the means to help Lazarus, and he chose not to.
And then there's Abraham's reply, specifically mentioning Moses and the prophets. That seems pretty central to the message.
Oh yeah, that's a key part. Scholars see it as highlighting the authority and completeness of the divine revelation that was around at that time, mainly the scriptures we call the Old Testament. The implication is if someone ignores what the scriptures clearly say, even something as crazy as a dude coming back from the dead won't change their mind. Some scholars even see it as hinting at Jesus' own resurrection and how many people refuse to believe it happened. It's a big push to engage with and believe the word of God. It's like, hey, the guidance is already here. No need to wait for some big flashy miracle to prove the truth.
So the message is the truth is already out there. You don't need some huge event to convince you. Now let's switch gears a bit. Our sources talked about the social and historical context of this story. How does understanding that world help us interpret the parable?
It's super important to understand the social and economic reality of first-century Palestine. It was a world of extremes. You had the super-rich elite living large and then widespread poverty. The gap was massive and impossible to ignore. Culturally, there was a strong expectation for the wealthy to be charitable and care for the less fortunate. Greed and hoarding wealth were huge no-nos. In this context, Lazarus represents those who are marginalized, completely dependent on the kindness of others to survive. The rich guy ignoring Lazarus right at his gate wasn't just a personal fail, it was a violation of social and ethical norms. So the parable is a head-on challenge to the social injustices that were all around in Jesus' time. It's a reminder of the duty of those who have plenty to help those who have nothing. The image of the rich guy stuffing his face while Lazarus starves right outside his door really hammers that point home.
A pretty harsh critique of that kind of societal indifference. And that leads right into the critique of materialism that scholars often bring up, right?
Yep. Spot on. You've got the rich dude with his fancy clothes and never-ending feasts, and then you've got Lazarus with absolutely nothing. It's a powerful critique of materialism. The story suggests that being obsessed with wealth and luxury can turn your heart to stone and make you blind to the suffering of those around you. It subtly promotes the idea of being rich toward God. That's not just about being super religious, but about being compassionate, generous, and using what you have to help those in need. It's a timeless warning about the dangers of getting too caught up in material things. It makes you think, right? About what we really value in our own lives.
The imagery and language in this story seems so intentional. Our sources pointed out the literary symbolism. What stands out to you?
Oh, it's packed with symbolism. Like we talked about, the rich guy's fancy purple clothes and fine linen, they weren't just comfy outfits. They symbolized his wealth, his status, like he was some kind of royalty. Then you've got Lazarus and his sores hanging out by the gate. That represents his extreme poverty, vulnerability, and how society had totally cast him aside. Even the dogs licking his sores, it's a detail that emphasizes his utter helplessness, how utterly ignored he was. Then in the afterlife, there's Abraham's bosom. It comes from Jewish tradition and represents peace, honor, and being close to a revered patriarch. It's like the ultimate reward for the righteous. Hades, on the other hand, is the realm of the dead, and in this story, a place of suffering and torment for the wicked. The rich guys suffering the fire, the thirst, they're metaphors for being separated from God and the emptiness of a life chasing after material stuff. And that big old great chasm, it's the ultimate symbol of separation and God's final judgment. It shows you there's no going back.
What about the characters themselves? The rich guy is nameless, but Lazarus isn't. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Some scholars think the nameless rich guy is meant to be a generic figure. He represents all those wealthy people who turn a blind eye to suffering. Lazarus, on the other hand, is given a name. And guess what his name means? God helps. It might symbolize the poor who find their comfort and hope in their faith. And even when the rich guy is suffering, he still comes across as kind of self-centered. First, he asks Lazarus to fetch him some water. Then he wants him to warn his brothers. He doesn't seem to get that he messed up big time by not showing compassion. Meanwhile, Lazarus just suffers silently in life, then finds comfort in the afterlife. This contrast might highlight how God cares, especially for those who are ignored by society. It shows how privilege can sometimes blind us to the suffering of others.
So privilege can blind you to the suffering of others. Considering everything, what do scholars say about the main purpose of this story? What was Jesus trying to get across by telling it?
It probably had several goals all tied together. It might have been a direct jab at the Pharisees, who were often criticized for loving money too much and ignoring the poor. It's a warning about the spiritual dangers of being wealthy and a reminder to show compassion and charity. For folks who are struggling like Lazarus, it offered comfort and hope. It highlighted that God cares for the vulnerable and that justice would ultimately be served. Importantly, it reinforces the authority of the scriptures as a guide for living a righteous life. And finally, it depicts the afterlife and the finality of judgment, emphasizing that our choices have consequences that last forever.
It's amazing how one story can pack in so much meaning. We touched on this earlier, but different Christian groups have different takes on this passage. Can we dig into that a bit more?
Sure thing. Interpretations of Luke 16.19 to 3:1 definitely vary across Christian traditions, especially when it comes to how literally we should take heaven and hell. Some groups are very literal. They see this parable as proof that heaven and hell are real places of eternal bliss and torment. Others might see Hades more as a temporary waiting area or even a state of soul sleep until the final resurrection. They wouldn't take the torment part literally. Some focus more on the symbolic aspects, emphasizing the spiritual consequences of our choices rather than describing the afterlife literally. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses often see the rich man and Lazarus as symbols of two groups whose situations get completely reversed. Adventists, on the other hand, tend to lean towards a non-literal understanding, emphasizing that the choices we make in this life have permanent consequences. It just goes to show how your existing beliefs can influence how you see things in Scripture.
And the emphasis on social justice versus individual salvation, that seems to be another point where opinions differ.
Oh, totally. Some people interpret this story as a condemnation of the rich man's lack of compassion and a call to action to fight poverty and inequality. Others might focus more on the individual's relationship with God and the consequences of following or rejecting God's laws. The interesting thing is, these two views aren't necessarily at odds with each other. Many scholars and theologians believe the parable speaks to both our social responsibility and our personal accountability before God.
It's not an either situation, it can be both. Our sources also talked about how this story connects to other parts of the Bible. Any key themes or passages that stand out?
For sure. The big things in this parable, justice, caring for the poor, the authority of the law, and the prophets, you find those all over the Old Testament. Look at the prophetic texts and the wisdom literature. They're full of similar ideas. In the New Testament, you see parallels with Jesus' other teachings on wealth, the kingdom of God, and things getting turned upside down. It's like in the Sermon on the Mount. There's also that interesting question. Some scholars wonder if the Lazarus in this parable is the same Lazarus that Jesus raises from the dead in John chapter 11. Some folks see a possible connection, maybe using a familiar name to add impact to the story. Others argue they're different guys with different roles in the Gospels.
It's all connected when you really start looking. Finally, and this is the most important bit for our listeners, why should we care about this story today? Why is this ancient text still relevant?
It's incredibly relevant. This parable challenges us to look at our own attitudes towards wealth and poverty, especially in a world where inequality is still so rampant. It's a serious warning about ignoring human suffering, both locally and globally. It encourages us to recognize the Lazaruses in our own lives, the people who are marginalized, forgotten, and struggling. It's a reminder to be compassionate, generous, and fight for justice for those who are vulnerable. In a world that often worships material success, this story is a reality check. It reminds us that wealth is temporary, but our choices have consequences that last forever. It tells us to prioritize things like kindness, compassion, and justice over chasing material stuff. And it reinforces the importance of looking to the Bible for guidance in living an ethical life. It's saying, don't dismiss ancient wisdom for the latest trends or chase after extraordinary experiences.
It reminds us that some moral truths are timeless. They still speak to us today.
Totally. Even though it's an old story, the questions it raises about our responsibility to each other, the dangers of materialism, and the reality of judgment, they still resonate with us today.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the story of the rich man and Lazarus, it's clear this story might seem simple at first, but it's got so much depth. It's sparked centuries of debate, and it's still teaching us important lessons today.
It really is amazing. This one passage touches on so many fundamental aspects of faith, ethics, and our understanding of the afterlife. It makes you think hard about what truly matters in the grand scheme of things.
Absolutely. And with that, here's something to ponder. In our world, with all its inequality, how does this story challenge your own views on responsibility and what it really means to be wealthy? Who are the Lazaruses in your life, and what can you learn from Moses and the prophets to live a better life today? It's something worth thinking about, don't you think? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.